Good morning, everybody. 11 on the head, so let's get going. I'm Dave Lago. I have with me Alex McFarland. We're from DISA's Hosting and Compute Center. Thanks to AFCEA for having us here today. Before we talk about Vulcan, a little bit about the Hosting and Compute Center, where we come from. But first, a public service announcement. It's 11 degrees warmer in the DC metro area than San Diego, which is just wrong. I was told it was going to be warm. Apparently that was not the thing. All right, but happy to be here. The Hosting Compute Center, we've got a couple of big products that you may or may not be aware of. The first one is the Joint Warfighting Cloud capability. I think you're probably aware of this one. It used to be called JEDI. It's in the news a lot. It was awarded recently. It's basically a commercial cloud contract for AWS and Azure and Google Cloud Platform and Oracle. It makes acquiring the cloud just much easier from that perspective, from the contractual perspective. Then you have Stratus. Stratus is our private cloud offering that we have today with a lot of customers. You have one that is near and dear to my heart, which is DoD Cloud IAC, because I was the product manager of that. These are templates that we give the customers for free to build out their cloud environment. Instead of doing 7 months of engineering work to design it and integrate it, we stand it up for them in a 4-hour session and give them the keys to a ATO'd platform environment. We've done that for 36 DoD organizations, so a big cloud adoption accelerator. And then containers as a service. Containers as a service is CAS. It is a container platform. It's RHEL under the covers, OpenShift. So a little bit of background there. We're going to talk about Vulcan, just the bluff on Vulcan. These are DevSecOps and Agile tools that are offered in a SaaS construct, and they're going to be available here, MVP in April. All right, when I talk about DevSecOps, I get a little bit of deja vu, because this was my old job 7 years ago. I was responsible for getting DevSecOps and Agile adopted within my Navy command, and we were real successful. We were the first military command that adopted DI2E, so I did the road shows with DI2E. If you're not familiar with DI2E, it's a similar model as this. Okay, it was a SaaS play, and it had a tremendous impact on the Department of Defense and adoption of DevSecOps. And I remember then thinking about it, right, about Agile, and I said, wow, this Agile stuff is fantastic. This is 7 years ago. It's going to spread like wildfire in the Department of Defense. And here I am 7 years later, and I don't know that I'd use the word wildfire. Maybe a really small fire, definitely not a wildfire, maybe a solo stove. But I think you see a lot of centers of excellence. People are aware of Agile. I don't think it's as widespread as we think it is. And when I talk about Agile, I kind of get the vibe that people think, oh, like you hate waterfall. And it's not true. I love waterfall. I have a master's degree in waterfall. I did it for 15 years. But it has its place, right? And its place would be anytime you're doing a network upgrade, right? Facilities upgrade. Network upgrades are big. We're DISA. We own the network, right? If you're refreshing hardware in a data center, that could all be waterfall. Platforms, airplanes, cars. Now it starts getting interesting, and I'll talk about it in a bit. When you look at like a Tesla, right? Where Tesla is not just a car company and a battery company; it's also a software company. So I'm assuming that they probably have a larger waterfall type project for the platform vehicle, and then the software itself, I'm assuming, is Agile. Right? They update that software on a monthly basis. So you're starting to see kind of that space of the waterfall project kind of shrinking, and the Agile one getting bigger. Why is Agile important? When to use Agile? Anytime you're doing anything software development related, it needs to be Agile. Anytime it's going to be something related to the cloud, it should be Agile. It's moving, it moves very fast. An example that I use is ChatGTP. Okay, so if I had a portfolio of AI/ML or even DevSecOps tools, which I do, and I wrote a fixed price contract 3 years ago, and I wrote out my requirements 3 years in advance, right, there would be nothing about ChatGTP, right? So doing Agile allows you to course correct and take advantage of a technology that comes along. Another interesting one are around the PaaS services that come from the cloud providers and other places. if you were planning to do an AI/ML service and do it the old-fashioned way, where you're integrating it, right? You plan that three years in advance, and then all of a sudden, now we have SageMaker, we have Azure Machine Learning. These are all services that you can push a button and build out, right? So the importance of Agile, we see it, there with cloud. I would argue that part of the reason Agile is not as big as we'd like it to be is the accessibility of tools. Right? So everybody has a Microsoft project, everybody has Excel, right? So they can make their integrated master schedule, right? And give it to leadership, and everybody could be happy about that. But do they have access to Agile tools? Do they have access to Jira? Right? Not as much as you would think. It's not as widespread as you would think. And so the play here with Vulcan is to make those tools accessible by offering them at a low price point, right? So that even a small project can afford it, and that's the play here. What is DevSecOps? I think everybody's aware of what it is. We've been talking about it for 7 years, but I'll give you my version of it. My version, it's about doing things more iteratively. Okay, in the old days, we would write code for 6 weeks and then find out, is it going to build or not? When you do the DevOps, you're doing nightly builds. Agile, that ability to course correct, like I talked about with the ChatGTP piece, really important. Continuous integration, doing builds like that. I think that's an area we actually are pretty good at in DoD. I think people are used to, they have the tool of choice they like, if it's Jenkins or Git or Bitbucket, right? And they're used to doing development, continuous integration. Continuous deployment, CD, not a lot of people are doing it. Right? We put a lot of restrictions around what goes into production, right? It's not something that we're doing through automation. I don't have a percentage, but if I had to guess how many deployments are done through some automated means, it'd be pretty low. Probably less than 5%. Would be my guess. Right? And then SecOps. So that's the whole thing about moving security to the left, which we've also been talking about for a while now. And it's that migration from the data-driven compliance, which we're so used to, the paper-driven to the data-driven, which is where we want to go, and having some of those tool results. I saw a really cool brief from the EMAS team last week, and that's for DISA. That's our ATO, RMF package system that they now have APIs to ingest scan results and things like that from mission partners during the build process. So that's really important, right? We want to do more of the automation and less of the paperwork. All right, so a little bit about the problem statement here. Everybody needs CI/CD software development tools, but running them yourselves is cost prohibitive. Unless you're some really big program like Joint Strike Fighter or something like that, it is a cost prohibitive thing. You need to have some economies of scale to make it work. So when I talk about Vulcan, I'm not talking. This is not a cutting edge technology play. It's not. This is a business play, right? To offer these tools at a low price. I talked to a fourth estate customer, and they mentioned to me that they had gone through the whole process of ATOing a software factory, and obviously 2-year process to build it, credit it, get it going, and they realized that it's cost prohibitive to run it. That basically they need a 10-person team to run that, and their whole workforce of devs and integrators is 100 people. So 10% of their workforce is maintaining those teams. So that's something that's really important. As far as the so we recognize that the cheapest way to get a service is to consume a SaaS from one of the vendors directly. Right? That's the ideal scenario. For the tools that we're talking about here, unfortunately, they're nowhere close to a DISA PA. Right? So in the meantime, we're offering these. We're doing we're getting the ATO for them. Right? We're offering it and meeting a very clear need in the Department of Defense. Another part here is I want to emphasize the low-cost part. We're going to talk more about some of the pricing, but that's an important thing too, because we don't want to have big barriers to entry for teams. There's a wide variety of spectrum of projects and development that goes on, and we want to be able to, support everybody and not leave anybody out. All right, I built up the suspense as long as I could. So here it is. Here's what it is. So Vulcan is a collection of DevSecOps and Agile tools. We have something currently today called GetMil. It's got 1,932 users that we're offering, and Alex is going to talk a little more about that. But we're also offering Jira. Jira is an Agile project planning tool, and Confluence. Confluence is a wiki that you can do to share documentation with your team. From a pricing perspective, we're offering both of those together. We're going through the Defense Working Capital Fund process to price it all out, but it's roughly $100 per seat per month. And so it may end up being $107.12 or something, but just to give you guys a perspective of what we're targeting here. And then the GitLab Premium part is a separate offering. So this is part of the MVP for Vulcan. We have two offerings, Jira and Confluence, and GitLab Premium. GitLab Premium is what you use to build your DevSecOps pipelines. Recommend you go and Google that product. You can see a lot of the tools that they have that come within there. And the whole approach to this, I keep stressing it, is doing things in a cost-effective way. And part of that was a small team. So we built this environment, this offering. It was basically 4.5 people to build and ATO the environment. Also, Alex, because he's a brilliant guy, did it. But in addition to that, he had a little bit of help. We didn't just start from scratch. We used DoD Cloud IAC to build the underlying environment. And then if everyone's familiar with Platform One, Big Bang, with the Big Bang distribution, we used that, and really awesome product there. And then we deployed our applications on top of that. So that's what it is, what it's not, and this is the number one question that I get every single time. They say, is it a platform? It's not a platform, it's a SaaS, just the SaaS, right? So there's a lot of confusion with that. We're not offering you're not gonna host your applications, we're not gonna host your data. We're not gonna offer you a dev, test, staging, and prod environment. Okay, that's a platform. There's a lot of great platforms in the Department of Defense today. I recommend you check those out. Totally different price point. They're not $100 a month, right? So that gives you an idea. And then as far as, part of this is we really wanted to meet customers where they're at in their journey, right? So these SaaS tools, you basically, there's something called a runner, and you bring your own runner and you're connecting up to that runner in your environment. So you can have your existing, dev test stage, wherever they may be, prod environment, and connect them up to Vulcan and be where you are. Now, we often talk about Vulcan being kind of like the glue between the different services that we have here within the hosting and compute center, because you could use Stratus, which is our private cloud. You can connect that up. You can connect up CAS. You can also use DoD Cloud IAC. We'd be happy to help you, stand up if you want to be in AWS or Azure or Google, help you to build out that environment, the standard environment that we have that has an ATO, and then you can connect it up to this and rapidly you'll be consuming the cloud in a decentralized way, and that's how we have approached this, as opposed to a platform which is a centralized play. All right, I'm going to pass it over to Alex.
So before I dive into the tools, it's worth talking a little bit about the why, right? So we talk about doing DevSecOps all the time, and why do we want it? What does it mean? Is it just because it's a buzzword and our boss heard about it and they say we need it now, or we read the DoD CIO guidance and this is the future, but we don't know what it is? But a lot of times you hear, it's because we want to go fast. We want to go fast. We sound like Ricky Bobby, right? I want to go fast. And how do we get to fast? Why aren't we fast right now? Why are we deploying quarterly right now? Why aren't we deploying weekly or nightly? It's because we're scared, right? It's because it's not safe. It's because we're going to blow up production if we deploy every night, or our last deploy that we did 3 months ago hurt. It took 12 hours because we haven't practiced it, and we rolled the stuff back. And so how do we begin to fix that? So for me, DevSecOps is about the convergence of people and processes and it's also about making change safe through automation, right? So developers have had CI/CD pipelines for a long time. So the sort of pattern where you have your IDE and you work locally and you code it, maybe you build it, and you deploy to a web server in your environment, and you test it, look good. So initially they just took that blob of stuff and they ran it in production, and what happened, and maybe it was consistent, or maybe the build just lived on the developer's laptop and they left the organization, and now we can't build the software anymore. So this evolves over time, right? So Git came along, and now we have a distributed version control system where multiple people can be working, and there's a way we can merge changes. We have branches in Git where we have a structure where we can flow our changes in, and more importantly have peer reviews in there. So you have this sort of I code locally, I check my code in, and your build server is going to react, right? It sees the code, it's going to run some type of build script in your environment. In our case, that's GitLab orchestrating that. But the pipeline and the build is yours, right? Because ultimately the pipeline is a automated business process that's your process. So you own your pipeline, you get to control it. Now, there's examples out there, and there's quick starts to get .NET code going and stuff, but your pipeline and your process is yours. So you check in the code, and then there's some sort of testing that runs, right? This could be unit tests. So unit tests is like your developers writing code, and they're testing the ins and outs of their function, right? So I feed data in, does the expected result come out? But it's kind of how it's working in isolation. I saw a meme that illustrated it pretty well, I think, between like a unit test and an integration test. It showed a men's room, and there was two urinals that are right next to each other, right? So separately, these two urinals, they flush perfectly well, the water goes down the drain, and it works, but you can't get two people standing right next to each other in there, right? So then you have integration tests to solve that problem. So this is, your system is up and running, your code is deployed, things are checking, there's a whole bunch of tools that you can run as part of your pipeline to do all this stuff. And then you have the release deploy phase. So Dave talked about CI/CD. So the CD can mean two different things. You'll hear continuous delivery and continuous deployment. So the way I like to explain to people who aren't familiar is, think of like the App Store with your phone, right? So continuous delivery might be you have this artifact built and it's published into a repository somewhere. So it could be the app phone, right? But it's not running on the device yet. And then continuous delivery is the app has been downloaded, installed on the device, and running. So in the context of your environment, this may mean pushing a package out to a service in the cloud. It might mean copying a blob of files onto a web server. It could mean a container deploy. So what's neat about all this stuff, though, so all these awesome tools existed for developers, right? And they've had this for a long time. But then infrastructure as code came along, and now infrastructure teams have the ability to kind of handle all this stuff. And so if we adopt this sort of development flow with the agile stuff that Dave was talking about earlier, right? Where now we have smaller changes that move through the system. We're not waiting quarterly to push. We're trying to have a full cycle of value. And that might be a small amount of value, but we're trying to deliver that frequently. So if you're deploying more often, you're practicing your process more often, you get better at it every time, right? Because our tendency is when something's terrible, we don't want to do it again, and we're going to avoid it as long as possible. Well, repetition is the key to mastery with almost everything we do. So infrastructure teams get to do this too, right? So if you think about how many people have perfect documentation for their production systems that are 100% up to date with the exact configuration and state of that environment declared, right? Like there's not a lot of hands. Well, what's cool about when you start doing infrastructure as code is we basically have executable documentation, right? So the state of your environment is in the code. So I make a change, but Dave needs to see in peer review to make sure that my code looks good before it goes live. Now, if we handle the version control, we know exactly when I made the change. We know when Dave approved it. And what's interesting about the peer review process, we're DoD, we have change control boards, and we're not going to get away from it anytime soon. But there have been academic studies that show that peer review is extremely effective for preventing disasters in production. And really, most of what change control boards do is prevent you from moving work forward. And so, if you take this a step forward now, so now there's this thing called GitOps. And you see GitOps most often in the context of a Kubernetes cluster because a lot of this stuff is a little bit easier to do in Kubernetes because it was designed with these methodologies from the ground up. So when you're working with Kubernetes, everything that you interact with is an API. And those APIs are written down in text files, a few different formats, but typically you often see it in the YAML format, which is pretty human readable if you understand what your things are supposed to look like. So the way this works is sort of similar to what we talked before, right? So I make a change, I want to update the version of a container that's running, right? Dave blesses that, that container had gone through my CI/CD pipeline, the application is in that, all these tests are run, it's known secure. Well, then there's linting tools that can run against it. There's infrastructure as code tools that can check to see if I'm making a security mistake in the YAML. So all this gets blessed off. Dave looks over my shoulder as a human to make sure that I'm not doing something stupid. And then this YAML gets pushed up the repository. Well, what makes this different than a lot of the traditional IAC models you had, where maybe it runs through the pipeline and there was like a lever that you had to push or a button to deploy or whatever. With GitOps, whatever the device is, typically Kubernetes, but it doesn't have to be, is watching your Git repository, and it's going to apply that change as soon as it hits. So all the checks happen before that, but once it's in the Git repository, your executable documentation is in place, and the state of your system references that. So because this is the source of truth, this is how you make changes, right? Your executable documentation is always perfectly up to date. So the goal when we start managing infrastructure this way is to get to the point where if someone logs in interactively on a server, it's kind of a security incident, right? Like it shouldn't be happening. So Dave talked a little bit about GetMil early on. So this is something that we stood up kind of quietly. It was built to originally support global directory. So anyone who's logged in to DoD 365 has seen the dog with the goggles or whatever. So that's global directory. But we didn't have a version control system to manage all the work that was done there. So GetMil was stood up for internal use originally. And along the way they went, why don't we just enable self-registration on it? And so it's quietly grown. So we ramp about 200 users a month. So like Dave said, it's actually 1,900 users. This slide's a little bit tough to keep up to date. So we just saw a gap and made it available. So can we actually make this work? So look, we're a tools platform, we're providing you tools, but ultimately like the people problem and the process problem is the hardest thing to solve here. So typically when we see the problem that DevOps were supposed to solve, you have this graphic, right? And there's a developer and they have their built package and they're chucking it over a wall. And the wall is labeled the wall of confusion. And the operations team gets on the other side. So the developer doesn't know what the real infrastructure looks like. They have no idea. They've been forced to throw together something on their own, barely get things working. It builds on their laptop, it's fine. Their peer reviews have gone, but they don't know, they have no context of what operations looks like. So they throw it over the wall of confusion to the other side. Operations team receives this thing. It doesn't work well in their environment because it could be security constraints, whatever. So they fight this package now to get this thing working. And they have a hard time. And this is how we end up with quarterly deployments or 6-month deployments or longer. So the idea was, how do we start converging people and processes? How do we start bringing together to get these two teams talking? Well, in DoD, a lot of organizations, now you have the problem of security too, where we didn't talk to them at all until maybe it was in production. We get an audit or a scan that comes back wrong, and now we're refactoring things in production, trying to get them caught up. So when we talk about shifting things left, it's buzzwordy, but all that really means is we're trying to get all of your experts involved early in the process, right? Because you have this notion of you can do a little rudder far away from the rocks or a lot of rudder close to the rocks, right? And we're trying to avoid a lot of rudder close to the rocks. So I started trying to grassroots this stuff in the organization that I was with, gosh, I guess about 9 years ago. I'm getting old. And there was some resistance at first, but eventually people started to catch on. Back then, I'd have told you that DoD is doomed, it's never going to happen, it's not moving along, and I was extremely frustrated. But like Dave was saying now, we have centers of excellence. DevSecOps is now a buzzword. Everybody wants it, even if they don't understand why. And I think the cultural push is starting to happen, right? So I think some of the reasons why we had a hard time here is we aligned all of our teams along the discipline rather than along a value stream. So a value stream being, this is what happens from the time we get our requirements to the time it goes live, and all the things that happen to bring that in, from your contracting folks, all the way through. So we broke it out, and we built the wall of confusion. Well, why would we do that? Well, we have this separation of duties requirement, right? Where developers shouldn't have production access. But separation of duties shouldn't mean separation of context or separation of fate or separation of understanding. And I think we're starting to see some of this shift. So, kind of my promise to myself was I didn't want to just talk about tools when we did this conversation because, we can provide the tools. And Jira and Confluence helps you make your work visible. You can automate these flows through. You can have your teams involved so they can see all this stuff. You can build your pipelines with visibility and scanning tools all the way down. But, all because we give you a hammer doesn't make you a carpenter automatically, right? So you have to, it's on you guys for organizational change. And sometimes the best DevSecOps tool is, is like a beer at happy hour with someone from another team. That could be more effective than a lot of this. Or at least without that, this stuff doesn't get to where it could be. So the Japanese have this notion of called Kaizen. So it's constant improvement. And, typically we overestimate what we can do in one day or 1 week if we push really hard in one big shot, and underestimate what we can do over the course of a year, making lots of small changes, always trying to move forward and always trying to learn. And so if you look at DevSecOps, whether you're doing lean or you're talking about agile or whatever, or even a lot of the stuff that was championed by Toyota, it's all about becoming a learning organization. So what does that mean? This is what all your ceremonies are for in Agile. This is what the feedback is part of, where everybody can see what's going on in the context of your pipeline. It's how you learn and improve. It's making all that practice, that repetition you're doing worth something. And really, like in our space, when you're talking about information, the best thing that we can do, or really in any of it, is to outlearn you're the enemy, right? That's how we win. So I get asked a lot, like where do I start? And there's a quote from Alice in Wonderland that I'm going to butcher. It's something about, the king replied gravely, start at the beginning until you reach the end and stop. We'll never finish here, right? But just choose something small, right? Are you using version control at all? I used to stand up Windows servers, and there's a registry setting you do to enable remote management of IIS. And I Googled that registry setting every single time I built a server. I couldn't remember, every single time. And it got to the point where, how do we get things started? I said, well, why don't we just start, we weren't advanced enough yet to do infrastructure tools, code tools. We weren't quite there for Ansible or Chef or Puppet or all the rest. But I just created a script that said, number one, and it had the command by the registry on that. And eventually that evolves, right? And it's executable documentation. Now, it's not perfect, and it's not maintaining the state, but it's a good place to slide in. And basic tools can go a long way. And now this, you evolve your way in infrastructure as code, but it doesn't, and I'm not championing that approach necessarily, but it's a simple way to start, right? Like, just do something small and choose it and do it. You don't have to refactor your whole organization. And also, I would say that, look, a lot of this stuff has a container bias. I'm talking Kubernetes and GitOps and all the rest, but just using something like Jira and Confluence and changing your processes and working and talking together. And if our $100 a month is too much for you, and it's not going much, you can do $100 a month. Get some sticky notes and put them on a wall and talk to your team, right? Do that at least. So that's really all I have. I was told that dropping the mic is frowned upon, so I'll take questions instead. The question was, what are we doing with Ansible playbooks, and if we're doing anything with that as that next step? So currently, in the hack, our data center team is doing a major push to automate as many of their processes with Ansible as possible. They're diving in because they have a large data center operation. There's a lot of Red Hat, there's a lot of Windows, it works pretty well across that spectrum. We are not doing like Ansible as a service, at least not right now as part of MVP. So this is an MVP offering, right? So you hear about the 80-20 rule a lot, and where you do 20% of the work and you get 80% of the value. And we feel like that's what we're doing first, and then a lot of that's going to be demand signal afterwards. So certainly internally at the hack, this is data centers, right? Like, we have a large demand for Ansible. We don't know if a public Ansible server is necessarily a good idea for industry-wide. We've talked about it a little bit. We're not quite there yet.
Hello. So you mentioned IL5. What about above IL5?
So we don't have timelines for Vulcan for IL6. However, there's something called Command and Control Software Factory from DISA, which is something we're trying to partner with for that. And we plan to have an ATO, I think, by the end of the fiscal year.
Sorry, a follow-on question. So for your customers or users that want to deploy on these higher level networks, and maybe they want some of those tools, what do they usually do? Or do they just stay on the class?
So every time I get this conversation, we have to start it with, make sure, yes, but make sure you're doing as much development on the low side, as you possibly can. I came from the intelligence community, and we did the opposite for a long time, and it was borderline insanity. But But so there is a use case for that last mile, right? If you're 95% unclass and you got 5% class, you still need the tool for the 5%. C2SF would be my answer from DISA. There's also other options out there. I would research that. But from a DISA perspective, I would look at C2SF. Anybody else? All right.
Two questions, but pretty short. First question is mainly for industry partners. You guys have went over your tool stack already. Are you looking at other tools to include into that stack, maybe after this prototype, because you described it as a proof of concept or a prototype? That one first.
We are always looking at ways to learn and grow and improve and change as part of it, right? Or I'd be a pretty big hypocrite after standing up here and talking about all that stuff. So we're always happy to talk. I would qualify it with this, though. A major focus of this is we're trying to keep the cost as low as we can, right? Because we're trying to get it into many people's hands. There are large, awesome solutions like Platform One that are out there, that'll hold your hand through the whole process and get you going. But there's that niche of people, maybe they have a small group of experts with no budget, or maybe they just don't have budget at all to get started, and they're looking for a place to jump in, and we don't want to leave them out. But for sure, we're always happy to have conversations and know about good ideas.
Thank you. Second question, really quick, is more for the mission partners interested potentially in using this SaaS. Have you guys considered in your prototype to offer I'll quote it, free tier to the mission partners for, and I'll give you an example, right? DoD, I got a team of 3 guys, 3 engineers, and we like to screw around and write some code, and we need a service like this to be able to use and say, hey, can I just practice with this CI/CD concept so that I can sell it to my superiors and then use that to justify budget, right?
No, it's a good question. So web.get.mil, which you talked about, is free. And so we see that. And the problem is, and just to be transparent here, is there's a business case, right? So we have something called the Defense Working Capital Fund, right, which has rules about how we do things. So we want to try to see if we can maintain some kind of maybe it's for 90 days or something, free tier like that. But it's really a business thing, and it's a little tough.
That makes sense.
I can't say that be able to say that it's $100. Is a pretty it's hard to say $100 a month. So hopefully we don't lose too many folks with that.
Yep, no, I appreciate it. Maybe free tier for small group, limit the project or something, 90 days, and base it on use or something.
Yeah, and then on your previous question, so leadership did tell me, make sure you say it's an MVP. So this is, what we talked about is just the beginning. There will be other tools that follow this model.
Thank you. I was just wondering if compartmentalization amongst the different agencies and departments causes a problem with code sharing. How do you control that? How do you think about that? Just curious.
I can give you Dave's answer on that. Well, clearly there's a need, right? There's a need to share code. We had Forge.mil, right? But I think that we often struggle with these big enterprise and funding enterprise services like that. So I think that there's a need for it, but it's just not clear how to fund that, unfortunately.
Yeah, and in the context of Vulcan itself, we carve out your chunk of GitLab, and you can manage who gets access to it and who doesn't. There's still the random seaman working on stuff somewhere who doesn't have a budget. Where do they put their code? And that kind of keys to the other question. We have conversations about it, but difficult problems.
Any other questions? All right, thank you everybody. Really appreciate your time today.